I'm afraid the images of Afghani mothers handing their babies over the barbed wire to American soldiers are seared in my mind. Those mothers, they acted in desperation to get their little ones out of Kabul before the American government finally turned its back on them and left the country, leaving billions of dollars of US military assets for use by a vicious terrorist group. The Biden administration has taken a beating for this ugly exit from a war that did indeed need to end. No wonder the president has seemed recently to turn the page to other crises that still don't quite have the power to erase those Afghan mothers from the public's mind. I mean, the other crises like abortion, COVID, climate change, trillions in spending, a California recall election. So rather than just shaking our heads, we are going to try to discuss all this in some detail today on this latest edition of the Independent Outlook. Welcome, I'm Graham Walker, coming to you today from the studios of the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California. We're right across the bay from San Francisco, and we try regularly to bring you an independent vantage point on the issues of the day. And of course, as always, I am joined by my two collaborators, my colleagues. First of all, David Theroux, founder and president of the Independent Institute. Hey, David, good to see you.
Good to see you.
I'm sure all of our friends are glad to get back in touch with you and with us. Also, my colleague, Williamson Evers, Bill Evers, who is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Hi, Bill.
Hi, how are you?
Great. I'm glad to see you both. We did take a bit of a pause on these broadcasts for some of the summer weeks, but boy, the news didn't take a pause, did it?
No.
We have a lot to talk about. So let me remind some of our participants that there are mechanisms through the various channels that you're using, especially if you're using Facebook, I think, and YouTube, that you can type your comments in and those will get to us in due time. So take advantage of that. Okay, so just a couple weeks ago, President Joe Biden said about Afghanistan, he said, "My fellow Americans, the war in Afghanistan is over. I made a commitment that I would end this war, and today I have honored that commitment." It was a pretty proud declaration, but the emphasis on honor kind of stuck in my craw. Was that an honorable exit from Afghanistan, David Theroux?
I think the idea and need to withdraw should have been pursued a long, long time ago. And there was a delusion to the Washingtonian conceit that they can build a new society, both as far as the politics and the culture. And this nation building just was runaway. And George W. Bush, I think, is the originator of the fallacy in Afghanistan as well as Iraq. I do think that it's worth noting that in Biden's case, he was one of the big advocates of the war in Afghanistan as well as Iraq. He said, "And like it or not, our leadership role must include soldiers on the ground. If others step forward, fine, but whatever it takes, we should do it. History will judge us harshly if we allow the hope of a liberated Afghanistan to evaporate because we failed to take the course."
That's Joe Biden.
That's Joe Biden. And he was
Wow.
like that for most of the war.
Just to say something also about George W. Bush, when he was campaigning for president, I can vividly remember Condoleezza Rice, who was a major supporter of his before he became president, counselor to him, and is now the director of the Hoover Institution. I can remember her saying, President George W. Bush does not believe that the airborne forces of the United States should be leading kindergartners in foreign country to school. And so he originally campaigned as a constrained or moderate realist in terms of his foreign policy and military policy. And then I can also remember Condoleezza Rice coming to say, well, we're in the country. We don't want to leave it worse than we found it. We want to leave it maybe slightly better. And then they just plowed forward into this, partly because in the foreign policy establishment, there aren't a lot of constrained realists. There aren't a lot of people who favor strategic disengagement. And they start stepping from military into carving out spaces of control, and then they decide, well, then we have to do something in those spaces, and the mission creep just accelerates, and until they're doing exactly what David said. They have unbelievable overreach. It's a hubris, no doubt.
It's also worth noting that Bush was a critic of Clinton's interventionism.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, but the reigning paradigm is that the U.S. is the world's policeman,
Yes.
and the progressive view that you can create societies from the top down, and that is essentially what they try to do. And so you had every manner of Western progressive culture being brought into a very conservative religious society that doesn't even have a centralized
people in the society have been fighting against centralization for all of recorded history.
That's right, exactly.
Obviously before recorded history.
We're talking about going back to Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
So anyway, to get back to your specific question, Graham, my view is that the Biden disengagement plan was a total debacle. They should have not given up. Why do they abandon the Bagram Air Base overnight?
That's what I wondered too.
Why do they give the Taliban a list of all the people who worked with the U.S.? And on and on. So I think that there are big questions that are not being answered. They're not even being asked, and people are not being held accountable. And part of it may be that Biden abandoned the Trump approach, which was that they were going to first get the civilians out, people in the embassy, the people who were translators and all the rest of it, and then at the end get the military to withdraw, but in the process get rid of the military equipment or essentially make it inoperable. But they did the opposite. And so I think that raises significant questions. It isn't like the French leaving Algiers. It's not the same as the US leaving South Vietnam. There were months and months of time they could have pursued this, and it's been a discussion for years. So I think that there's a lot of culpability.
Obama was essentially moving to get out of Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. Why didn't they have contingency plans?
They did have contingent plans.
But they didn't. Yeah. It's complicated, having been involved with the Iraq occupation and administration of that myself. You make these plans, but circumstances change, and it's very difficult to have things turn out the way you might estimate them to do. But I do think the interesting thing is, instead of the debacle of the exit being a lesson to don't be hubristic, don't think you can remake the world, whether it's remaking the world by stabilizing it, by putting in some horrible people and helping them, or remake the world by transforming it, nation build, try and model other countries on the United States that are not interested in being that way, or thinking that by remaking the world you're going to stabilize it. They have all kinds of versions of this hubristic idea about how, instead of just defending the United States, they're going to police the world. Instead of this, the lesson that the punditry and many journalists are taking is, we should have stayed for years more in Afghanistan, and we should do more things like this. And it's by not doing an orderly exit and by not protecting the people who would help the American troops and having an ugly experience for them, in a sense, the foreign policy blob, the foreign policy establishment in Washington, has left itself a kind of ticket or a program for why this kind of thing, should happen again, because
they're going to want to
break up women's protests, and people
mm-hmm.
occupy music institutes and destroy the instruments.
So most of the public has been in favor of disengagement for some time.
Yes.
And both Trump and Biden were on the record for it. But one of my arguments essentially is why did they pursue it the way they did? I don't think it was they just fell into it. I think there were decisions made, and they had plenty of time. So I think those are real questions. But I think the bigger point, Bill, that as in keeping with your point, is that this is essentially turning out to be a way to discredit disengagement in general. We shouldn't disengage from any place.
That's right. They're trying to use it.
And if they'd done it properly, and it's not that complicated. For example, Charles de Gaulle advised President Kennedy.
They're doing worse than Dunkirk. Okay.
Right. That's right. Right. So President de Gaulle of France advised President John F. Kennedy not to go into Vietnam, and his point was that these so-called colonial wars always end up bad. You can never win. The cost is enormous. There's no way to calculate whether it's successful or not, and so on and so forth. Kennedy ignored it, as did Johnson, and history is there.
So the conventional wisdom is that the conservatives are responsible for all the wars of the United States. Both Vietnam and Afghanistan had plenty of liberal support, and your quote from Biden is a perfect example of that.
Right, and so de Gaulle's experience, of course, in part was because of not only the French being in Vietnam, but also the experience of Algiers and elsewhere. And so I think that there are big lessons. Fortunately, people are asking questions, but I think, as you're saying, Bill, the foreign policy establishment is going to fall back on the tried and true paradigm narrative that they are needed, and they need not to relinquish any of their power. I mean, Milley has not admitted any errors at all.
Amazing.
Right? I mean, it's astounding.
Yeah.
And all these, we have emails that now are showing that there was all sorts of duplicitous deals behind people's backs about the Taliban. Apparently, some of the aircraft have finally been released. The private chartered aircraft have finally been released, but only after it became public that the State Department was blocking their ability to be released in these different airports in Afghanistan. So I think that there is some big issues here, and I think I've mentioned this in the past. In the early years, when Lyndon Johnson was president during the Vietnam War was being escalated, Johnson was asked at a press conference how to understand the U.S.'s mission and policies in Vietnam, in South Vietnam. His answer was no different from our domestic policies, i.e. the Great Society.
Okay. So they wanted to build a TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, in the Mekong River system.
Exactly.
No, they overtly said that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Wow. The most striking thing that I am gathering from your comments of the two of you so far is that while my initial inclination was simply to attribute the debacle of departure to simple incompetence, and no doubt that was a factor, but both of you have pointed out is that there were actually underlying interests, institutional interests, or ideological inertia, which may also have pushed people to make foolish decisions about how to manage the exit, because otherwise it might not have the desired effect on public opinion. That's kind of striking, and it strikes true.
Well, the progressive. Go ahead.
I just want to say another thing, though. Let's take the idea that a lot of this was just accidental bungling. Part of what people in the establishment forget, because of their hubristic idea that they can control things pretty readily and they're experts and therefore, how could something go wrong? Is people forget how fast the Ceausescu regime fell in Romania. How fast, even though it, took a few years after the U.S. military left, but how fast, when it did fall, the Saigon government fell in South Vietnam. How fast the Russian government fell under, after Gorbachev and all the secession of all the countries. How fast East Germany, Hungary, all these things crumbled. It was very fast. how fast the Nicaraguan Somoza regime fell. It was very fast. There's a kind of sociological, psychological insight that's been present among analysts of this sort of thing for a long time. David Hume has it. I believe Bernard de Juvenal has it. A lot of people have it. And that is that governments are dependent on a kind of acquiescence, a kind of psychological deference from the population, from their own employees, from their military, from their police, and that can crack, that can be withdrawn very quickly. And when it does, the government dissolves. And we saw a very clear case of this with the Afghan government. So here are the Taliban with their Sharia law and their running of various roads, and in contrast, the American propped up government, which of course from our classical liberal viewpoint did uphold some liberties, but from the villager in Afghanistan, these were corrupt, centralized alien interlopers who were confiscating their goods more than the Taliban were. And, the peasant wants to be left alone. And the peasant doesn't have the values of the foreign aid worker of the U.S. State Department. And so, the Taliban were able to swim in the sea of guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, that's for
Well,
sure.
I think also an important lesson in this is that nations exist, languages exist, communities exist.
Right.
And the view that you're going to centralize power and rule these traditions and these bonds
Kinship
that people
groups,
have.
just the valleys. I mean,
Exactly.
The valleys. Some people there are the descendants of Genghis Khan's Mongols. Some people are Tajik. Some of them are Uzbeks. Some of them are Pushtun. Some of them are very much like Iranians and Persians. So they're all floating around in different valleys there. They all hate the central government taking taxes and telling them what to do. And so then the added layer of people that don't speak any of the languages coming in and telling them all what to do, doesn't work very well.
David,
as de Gaulle said.
Well, my point is a broader point, and that's that there's a reason why Brexit occurred. There's a reason why Hungary and Poland don't like the European Union. There is there's an ongoing conflict between centralizing power and dispersing power.
Catalonia and Spain.
Right, exactly, and Italy and so on and so forth. And in the United States, I mean, the Make America Great movement was a movement to recognize a nation that is different and unique and so forth from the global entities that are trying to impose rules on it. So it's a reality. And it's not to say that every community and ethnic system is defendable, not at all. But the point is that it's real.
We're not defending Geronimo here.
Right? We're not defending the Taliban's treatment of women. But the point is that it's a reality. And to believe that you can just step in and change the culture with a gun to someone's head is simply foolish.
David, your point about the reality of nations and communities is very striking. It seems to me that many of the so-called neoconservative advocates of intervention and of occupation and nation building and so forth, who really were in some ways also just the same thing as neoliberals, they're in their imagination, what exists are individuals. And over the course of political history writ large, all centralizing powers prefer to have those over whom they dominate to be a mass of individuals, because individuals are much easier to count.
We believe in individuals, but we also believe that a healthy individual life is bound up in all sorts of social connections.
Absolutely, both.
Clubs, religions, family, kinship groups, charities, all these sorts of things. And the tendency of totalitarians and Rousseau people and modern technocratic liberals is to try to wipe that out and have the state on the one hand and the isolated, atomized
Right.
monads on
Individuals
on the other. So it's not that we don't believe in individual rights, that we don't believe in individual achievement, that we don't believe in individual excellence. Of course we do. But also those individuals have social connections, and the state should not wipe those out.
Here's a quote. Well, this isn't quite a quote, it's a paraphrase I came across last week from former President George W. Bush, who made these comments right after the retreat. He said that as much as 60% of Afghanistan's current population was born in the last 25 years. And he then theorized that American occupation may have left those Gen Z Afghanis with a fonder perception of US, of the United States, and of personal freedoms than of the Taliban, because given our military presence, they would have developed a taste for Americanness. I found that really troubling, that somehow he likes the idea.
I mean, we, as both of you are saying, we are relational beings. Every individual only exists because of the relationships they've had from their birth onward. And those relationships, those loving relationships, kin, trust, all the rest of it, is fundamental to the existence of the individual. It doesn't negate the fact the individual has agency and purpose and all the other factors that's in individual minds, but to separate the two, to believe that individuals are some sort of autarkic, self-contained entities, free-floating in space, is nonsense. And as an extension of that, those kin relationships and so forth, those traditions are fundamental. And if you try to impose rules without respecting those relationships, you're in big trouble. Now, the classical liberals, Adam Smith and others, one of their big arguments, of course, for peace was trade. And the reason was because you respected other people and their rights and where they're coming from, and you have relationships and cooperation by respecting them as individuals and where they come. I mean, the existence of Constantinople in history as one of the crossroads of the world, and the Middle East in other spots, but especially Constantinople, is because there are trade routes, and people may not smell nice, and you can't understand what they're saying, and whatever, but you want to trade with them because it was in your interest, but also you have relationships that you develop because you need to have those relationships too. So this interventionist central planning model is a fallacy, and it applied to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was by force of arms trying to keep all these different ethnic groups together. And it was a fallacy, and to only, socialism itself as a centrally planned system is a fallacy. And as Ludwig von Mises pointed out in his book Socialism, the way he put it essentially is the only way socialism could exist would be the annihilation of the great bulk of the human race, because you wouldn't have these different perspectives and backgrounds and traditions and so on, and everybody would be harmonious, but it would only be a tiny group.
So if you get back to the quotation from George W. Bush, I think we have to kind of separate some things. So at a time when, say, pre-communist days, even pre-Sun Yat-sen days, Shanghai had a lot of Western influence in it. Some was because of, little districts where they had self-rule of the Westerners. But the point is, people adopted things from the West that they wanted and retained things from their traditional and customary life that they wanted. And some of that may have spread into the hinterland and so forth. But that wasn't imposed. Okay?
Right, it was a natural process.
And similarly, Constantinople or other trade centers, some ideas came from the different people that came through, and the people adopted it or they didn't. I mean, we're using Arabic Hindu numerals because they're more convenient than Roman numerals, and they have a zero, and whatever the thing is, it has some value, And so people adopt it, or they like it. Maybe they just like it, or it's different, or whatever. And the thing is that, George W. Bush is right that some things will, but if they're imposed, they'll be felt to be alien, and
Right.
people will say, this is just symbolic of, and the fundamentalist, tyrannical Islamists will try to combine the two. I mean, right now they're saying that these women who might be saying, I'd like to have an education and I'd like to be respected as a human being, they're just saying, oh, you're just a spy of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So in a sense, by trying to impose this on these societies, people that genuinely want to borrow from another culture are seen as agents of an imperial power. And that's kind of an unfortunate thing for the people who want to have a more modernized way of life, even if their neighbors are adopting traditional practices or readopting traditional practices.
Right. I mean, it's a shame to give a negative charge to some of the good Western customs around individual liberty and choice.
Well, the idea of the invisible hand is not just applicable to economics. It's true to language. It's true to mathematics that you're referring to religion,
customs,
to foods. I mean, it's all sorts of things. And in fact, it's the bulk of human experience is an invisible hand system. Now, invisible hand doesn't mean that it's a chaos theory thing. It means individuals have agency and they're choosing. But the difference is, are you choosing to cooperate with people peacefully, or are you choosing to impose your rule on people? And it's unfortunately in the modern world, the natural law tradition, which was developed as, generally speaking, one that was to respect other people, and there's objective good and evil and legal sense and all the rest of it, was pushed aside and embraced a utilitarian argument of the end justifies the means. And it's a straight shot from that to what we've been seeing in so many instances since the 1900s, actually. So
I'm wondering if we might want to pivot to some of the distractions.
Yeah, I think so.
Because it's just, here is a president who looks like he's done a dishonorable thing and he's left people who might turn into hostages and something really ugly could happen to them.
Yeah,
and he's trying to turn the page. He's trying. I mean, in your long list, you left out another one, which is the chaos at the southern border.
Right.
There's quite a number of things that are going wrong. And I mean, today, Los Angeles is deciding on whether to mandate that children in schools have vaccines. And there's a huge fight on masks in schools. And
well, Biden talked today.
Many things that are going on in the country that the Democratic politicians and some of the Republican politicians would rather deal with than seriously analyzing why the arrogance of power abroad should have a lesson for us all.
Biden's popularity has just gone below 40% as far as approval, which is almost unprecedented in such a short time being in office. And I would suggest that there's no floor because Biden doesn't really have a sort of cult following.
Right. He doesn't have a real constituency within the Democratic Party.
Right. He
He's
has interest groups that find him useful, but that's about it. So, it depends on how many of these things they try to control. So you've got not just the southern border. So, people who are in favor of free migration are admirable. But the point here is these people are trespassing on lands, they're burning, they're killing people, they're kidnapping, they're sex trafficking. I mean, it's not a free trade system.
Right.
So it's inflation, it's the COVID issue, it's all these many things that are piling up. And the Biden crowd, the group that, in my opinion, basically is directing what's happening, and Biden is simply the sort of the spokesperson for it, or some people would consider sort of the puppet, is trying to adapt, as Bill is saying, to get out from under this image of the debacle in Afghanistan.
So they like to talk about abortion, because they hope that can be a rallying cry for them.
Yep.
In the elections that are coming up. And they'd like to talk about all the handouts and programs and expansions of programs that they want to have in their $3.5 trillion boondoggle, which is sort of crumbling a little bit. I think
it's crumbling.
I think there's a lot of signs that he's not going to get this.
I think, yes.
Maybe 1 trillion. By the way, that's a lot of money. Also.
I was going to say 1 trillion.
But
yes, that's right.
No,
I think you're right, Bill.
We now have to modify Everett Dirksen a little bit and say 1 trillion here, 1 trillion there. Pretty soon it adds up to real money.
That's right.
But Joe Manchin is really off the reservation as far as going along with this huge, huge spending. To us, I think we'd have to say, yes, the spending is bad. The taxes that are going to come with the spending is bad. The debt that's going to come with the spending is bad. But it's also the programs, because by expanding these programs, and even if they cut the money but keep the programs will then get built up over time. So the real thing is to not have new programs and cut back programs instead of expanding them.
If only.
Because,
and the Afghan experience.
They want to make it like a European social democracy. That's putting a kindly name on it, tag on it.
That's being generous, I think. I mean, Biden spoke today, giving his talk on vaccinations and masking. Yeah. And he has this 5-point plan, which is essentially boils down to everybody being vaccinated with booster shots every 6 months or something, in perpetuity is what it comes down to. That they want children to be vaxxed, they want children to be masked. So it's basically the therapeutic state totally out of control, and using it as a way to scare people. One of the major reasons they're pushing it is not just because Big Pharma benefits, and that's part of their constituents and so forth, and the bureaucracies, but it's also because they believe that one of the few areas that Biden has been popular on is on the COVID issue. So with Afghanistan pulling him down and people being concerned about the schools and about inflation and so on and so forth, they think they can recover.
I hope they can recover.
They hope they can recover. I don't think they're going to be able to. I think it's too late. And also they believe that their policies actually work.
Yeah, but I would like to draw our listeners and viewers' attention to a new video that's been posted on the Independent Institute website, which is an interview that Graham and I did with Dr. Scott W. Atlas. Scott is a fellow at the Hoover Institution.
And a senior advisor for Independent.
And he was on the White House COVID-19 task force. Yes. And so in relation to some of the things David was just talking about, he advises strongly that people over 50 should get a vaccine and do what's medically indicated in terms of the number of those vaccines, because they are threatened, people with also certain pre-existing COVID. But he says, look, we also have liberty. We also have rights. You can't just impose some kind of medical totalitarianism on our society and still call it a free society. And as far as the vaccine for children, young people, not really indicated. Again, they should be free to be doing things if the doctor and the parents, or as they get older, they themselves decide to do it. But it's not, children don't get the disease. It's very rare. It's extremely tiny, minuscule, almost undetectable number of deaths. They don't give it to adults. This stuff about masking and giving vaccinations to school children is not called for. It's just wrong public policy. Masks cannot prevent the spread of the disease, which is primarily spread by aerosols. Tiny, tiny, unseeable, tiny droplets
Well,
that go
smaller
right
than
through.
droplets.
They go right through. Yes, that's right. They're not droplets. They're just tiny.
It's the molecule.
Yeah, whatever.
Right.
It's a molecule plus a little moisture that's attached. But the point is, if you're breathing through the mask, which you have to, otherwise you're being suffocated, then the disease is coming out.
Exactly.
And so it's the masks, even an N95 mask, do not stop the spread of the disease.
The term that
being outside, ventilated, being distant, if you're infected, cover up, okay?
Yeah.
If you're a doctor operating over somebody and you might spit into the open incision, cover up. But it's not a way of, and these lockdowns were totally counterproductive. So we're getting all that back again from the Biden administration and many of the governors. So we'll see what happens.
So the term that Scott uses, as well as Gupta at Oxford and Bhattacharya at Stanford and others, is called focus protection. So you focus on the targeted protection, either focused or targeted, both.
Right.
And so the idea is that you're focusing on those people that have high risk, elderly, people with comorbidities, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But most people are not at risk.
And they should go on leading pretty much of a normal life.
Right. And the Delta variant is not anywhere as dangerous as the original COVID-19 novel virus. And what's happening here is the politicization of science and the politicization of medicine. And as I mentioned, this whole therapeutic state is really, it's not just unnecessary, it's dangerous. There's some epidemiologists and others who believe that it's a serious risk to have a one-size-fits-all vaccine for all people, because that actually will then tend to create other variants that can be even more harmful. Let the herd immunity continue to grow. And unfortunately, Biden and others don't want to recognize the existence of herd immunity. In other words, especially those who have natural immunity from having had COVID, which is apparently about 100 million people in the United States. Right. And so it's really interest groups and politics driving a health issue, and it could be very seriously misguided. Fortunately, more and more people are raising questions, and including scientists who are questioning the views of these people. One of the other little anecdotes I might mention is, of course, there were serious questions raised weeks ago about the origins of the COVID-19 novel virus, and that different people pointed out that the evidence all pointed to the Wuhan lab. And it was discovered that the National Institute of Health was funding the Wuhan lab through a group called
your taxpayer dollars at work.
Right. So being funded through this group, Eco Health Alliance, indirectly. The most recent thing that's happened is the discovery that of the actual documents that approved and were signed by Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins to approve the funding of gain of function at the Wuhan lab.
The virus more dangerous.
Exactly. So the question that was
explicitly saying this.
Right. So Rand Paul was correct, of course, in raising these issues, but the evidence now is overwhelming. The question is Fauci going to be held accountable? And the latest indication is the White House stands behind Anthony Fauci.
So I wonder if we could turn a little bit to our California recall election. So Governor Newsom has to go through a recall process because a not sufficient number of signatories to a recall petition were filed, and then over 40 candidates are running to replace him. I don't know what your thinking is, David. Polling has kind of varied. At one point, it looked like Newsom was going to have no problem. Then it started closing. then it started going again. Newsom's not going to have a problem. Maybe it's going back to maybe he is going to have a problem. I don't know what your thinking is. There's so many more Democrats than there are Republicans. There's a huge amount of independents, and a recall any special election, putting on my political scientist hat, it's very hard to predict who's going to end up voting in a special election. We just don't have enough experience with
Well,
it.
it matters apparently to the Biden administration, because even though Americans and others are apparently being held against their will in Afghanistan, Vice President Kamala Harris was here yesterday, just about a mile from our studios here. She touched down at the airport and had a big event here. And apparently President Biden is going to make a special trip out on Monday to campaign for Gavin Newsom. And of course, in the meanwhile, many California Democrats are alarmed because it's way closer than it should be. I think President Biden won over Trump by 29 points, and Newsom is only leading on the recall by most recent polls by just a few points at most.
And it varies. It depends on the poll.
It depends on the poll. And also, I think part of it is the fact that people are not trusting pollsters as much. And the issue is not really clearly Republican versus Democrat. Newsom has tried to make it that, and I think that's why there was a swing back. But I think as people thought more about it, the wildfires, the schools, the economic situation,
the arrogant dining in the French Laundry restaurant,
the lockdowns.
Two of the really interesting things. So there may be what we could call a Latino surprise coming in the election. So both a huge article in the Los Angeles Times and another huge article in the New York Times said that people who they described as Latino libertarians or rancho libertarians among Latino voters were, people who had strong family values, believed in hard work, thought pie in the sky government schemes didn't work, didn't help them, and were just tired of this. And that Newsom is looked at as an arrogant, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, elitist person who can't relate to Latino middle class, working class voters. So they may not vote, they may stay home, or they may vote for somebody, possibly Larry Elder. Gloria Romero, who's pretty much of a mainstream Democrat, except on school issues and parental choice in education, has come out for Larry Elder, who's one of the alternatives, the leading alternative by far to Governor Newsom. And she's in ads that are circulating on television and on the new social media. And so we might have a surprise there.
Yep, I think so. And I think we should also be mindful of the fact that the same people and the same pollsters were predicting that Clinton would beat Trump a little over 4 years ago, and they were wrong about that. Their pollsters were wrong in the most recent election this past November. They're way off again. Yeah. And I think that the other trends that we saw in the last November election of virtually every single one of these state initiatives went down to defeat. These progressive initiatives, plus numerous areas that had gone blue on the congressional level and also in some local district elections went red again. And that was not expected. So I think there is a big question. And I think that, for example, the incident that just occurred recently where Larry Elder was with his entourage, and they were in Venice, in Southern California, and up comes this woman on a bicycle who's wearing a gorilla mask, and she's throwing eggs hard-boiled eggs, essentially, I guess.
It was a white woman.
Right, a white woman, and the security detail was being pummeled by pellet guns and other projectives.
This may irritate some black voters.
Exactly. So you hear.
One commentator said, if this were Stacey Abrams.
That's right.
Oh, exactly.
Man. Somebody in a gorilla suit
Yep.
A white person in a gorilla suit,
Gorilla
throwing
mask.
eggs, gorilla
Yep.
masks.
That's right. Exactly.
Throwing
And-
things at a black candidate. So
And
I
who-
don't know, but I think we're more likely to see Latino voters that are discontented right now with the Democratic Party and tired of being taken for granted. But we might just have a surprise. I think the three of us would all say probably Newsom's going to stay on.
Probably.
But we also think it would not be astonishing. It would not be unheard of. We would not fall faint on the floor if he lost and if Larry Elder was the leading candidate.
I can't help but wonder in my own mind whether President Biden, who apparently looks at this as an important priority, this race in California, whether he might not have made a mistake today. I mean, an hour ago, he announced this new mandate where apparently not only federal employees and not only healthcare workers, but every employer of 100 or more people is going to have to mandate a vaccine or a weekly test. That's a big, big stretch.
It's a big stretch.
I have to say that in Orange County, so it's weird because our newspapers are failing right now. A lot of things are not getting reported, including this egging incident. It's not really getting much attention. But so in Orange County, sort of unknown to me, but I happened to be talking to a fairly high official in the Orange County government the other day, and there are demonstrators constantly outside the county administrative headquarters building all the time. And what is it that they're angry about? They're angry about mask mandates.
That's right.
They are going to possibly recall. I mean, Orange County has one of the most conservative governments in America. But they have acquiesced to some of this public health stuff that is really not really scientifically justified and is not in accordance with constitutional liberties. But they got persuaded, and they kind of did some of this stuff in the dark. So people, when you do things secretly, people are even more upset at you. Yeah. So they may end up recalling this government for this kind of thing. And I think David is pointing out that the president may be triggering something like a Tea Party reaction.
Right.
That he's
and I think also
before escaped, even though his $3.5 trillion is bigger than the most ambitious, much bigger than the most ambitious scheme of Obama. He has somehow, avuncular Joe has escaped the wrath of the mobilized public, but maybe he's going to get it.
Right on the heels of this debacle in Afghanistan, where he's left Americans behind.
Right.
It looks, and there are many, many vets. I mean, huge numbers of vets who are upset about this. I think it's something
these people on the planes that were delayed in northern Afghanistan, those were private charities and veterans groups and stuff like that organized it, and they kind of look in some ways more competent than the American government.
Right.
So and that's probably too harsh. But anyway, the point is, they were at least still trying to do something about it, whereas the American government had kind of thrown in the towel.
David, you said vets.
Yeah, I've heard that as many as between 30 and 40% of SEALs and Army Rangers are seriously considered about not re-upping because of the way Afghan was treated. Because one, the view is that they're going to sacrifice my limbs and my life and everything else, and nothing, if anything, it's worse afterward. So what's the point? And if I get in harm's way, they're going to abandon me. And they're going to abandon my brethren and my sisters who are in harm's way. So I think doing this vaccine thing right on the heels of that looks insensitive. But Biden, of course, is trying to project it as he cares.
Thinks it will work. He thinks
he
has a wrong causal theory about masks and stuff like that.
I think that's right. And it's not just the mask issue. Also, I mean, San Francisco, they just got approved the recall of the school board members. Right. So it's part of the schools, and of course this is shutdown. And who was responsible for the shutdown was Newsom.
Also in San Francisco, it's also the naming of the school. Tearing down George Washington, tearing down Abraham Lincoln, crazy.
And
stuff.
Dianne Feinstein School. Right.
So, that's right.
Right. So I think it is unclear But I do think that people are underrating the discontent that people have, especially in those communities that the Democratic Party takes for granted and has believed that they're loyal constituents, and they're the ones who are most victimized. And to Larry Elder's credit, he's been incredibly articulate about this. Here's a guy who came from a dirt poor family,
Right.
and in a poor part of Los Angeles, became an attorney, a successful entrepreneur, and he understands the issues. And the Democrats are desperate. They are petrified.
So articulately.
That's right. The Democrats are petrified that if he wins, it's going to not just change the governorship, but it's going to change politics in California, especially among African Americans and others. Right. And it could change the outcome. It could definitely be a big impact on 22 and 24.
So I'd like to skip a little farther into some of the zany stuff going on in education. And I have to say that Larry Elder has done very well, including bringing up the idea of firing incompetent teachers that don't teach a year's worth of learning in a year, and the kids go backwards and stuff like that. Why can't we fire these people? But anyway, so in New York City, the city Department of Education has sent out an order to the schools: stop doing class ranking, stop having honor roll. Why? Well, they're racist.
Yeah.
Come on, life is some pressure, some competition, some grading shows that people haven't learned things, or that some people are doing a better job and others need to catch up. And it's good for kids to begin to be initiated into this. A sort of symptomatic thing of the whole New York City debacle under progressive rule there is that Richard Carranza, who was the chancellor of the whole school system under Bill de Blasio, has moved out of he resigned and he moved out of the city. And he had appointed his girlfriend to various high-titled positions. She's a former elementary school principal. And he's going to, either, I guess he's their fiance now or something like that. But he gave her all these three-figure salaries and high positions. So instead of achieving things, and he was the main proponent of dismantling exam schools and excellence and pushing Asian Americans out of possibility to make advances in academic achievement, and just ruining the good things about the public school system in New York City. Turns out all along he was into this sort of special privileges for my girlfriend's kind of business. So the real meaning of equity turns out to be special privileges. Another thing that happened is in Los Angeles. So the union chief in Los Angeles, United Teachers Los Angeles, announced that there'd been no learning loss during the COVID lockdowns.
Well, that was good news.
Yes, except that it's completely false.
Right.
She said, it doesn't really matter that much if the kids don't know their times tables or something like that. They've learned about coups and insurrections, and they become politically more liberated. And that's this is the kind of thing that is going to cause an unbelievable reaction by the public when they don't see their children learning anything. And they learned about some of these lessons from the video program, the video schooling during the COVID lockdown, and the veil has been torn aside, and what was given almost mystical reverence to our teachers in schools, now they know what's going on. It's as if they had a video in the classroom. And to have these leaders say, "Oh, there's no learning loss. This is crazy." All sorts of studies have shown that over a year, it depends, it's a little worse in math than in English, but the point is terrible, terrible more than years, in many cases, loss of learning has taken place.
It's
particularly
tragic.
for low income, particularly for racial and language minority children who are already most challenged. So this is really whistling past the graveyard for this union leader to be saying this sort of thing.
Another thing that's related to this is also the revelation that that came out from a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit was filed by the Americans for Public Trust that divulged that the CDC has been changing its guidelines based on pressure from teachers' unions.
Yes, they run the wording by
Yes.
the leaders of the American Federation
You're
of Teachers.
kidding.
That's
No,
right.
It's true.
And so, as more of this is filtering down, the insensitivity and arrogance of people like Newsom and others, and it's not just California, it's obviously in New York and many other places, but since we were talking about the recall election in California, it is having an effect, and people are beginning to lose confidence in this system. And the case for school choice that Larry Elder is making seems a lot more appealing.
Yeah, he's making it very articulately.
Right.
And I might say that some people who have been political entrepreneurs, so to speak, in the past are talking about putting a referendum on the ballot in California saying that public employee unions should be outlawed. So we'll see if that turns out to be the case. There are also some school choice initiatives that have been filed. We don't yet know if they're going to have enough. This is all, highly speculative at this point. But there is some sign of discontent that might have serious consequences.
Well, I do think that it goes a little further, Bill, because I think the view of a lot of mothers is that the teachers' unions were in league with people like Newsom to keep the schools shut down.
Yeah.
And they're anti...
Even the LA Times admitted that Newsom had one of the worst records in the country on, so maybe sometimes talking a good game about reopening the schools, but deferring constantly to the unions.
Exactly.
This is the LA Times, which is like a super supporter of Newsom. They said, there's a troubling record on this. I completely agree with you, David.
So these teachers' unions and the CDC and the vax mandates and the mask mandates and the hypocrisy is all sort of congealing together to question the elite's control of the conversation and the policy.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. I do think it's up for grabs right now. And Biden, as Graham said, is planning on coming to California on Monday. And there are people who said, we want him to come because he is going to be toxic because of he's bringing this baggage that people they don't trust.
He thinks he's turning the page, but he's bringing some new baggage.
Right.
So he went to an public event not too long ago, and people were yelling at him, "You left our men behind."
Exactly.
You left our people behind.
Yes.
I think he has here's a guy who campaigned, I'm the adult, I'm the man, I'm the competent person, my people are the experts, they're going to know how to do the other. Trump was just a bumbling amateur compared to me. I have all this experience. Okay.
It kind of, fell flat. We've got a question. I just want to throw this into the mix. Well, one of our participants has taught, it's a provocative question, and we don't really have to answer it directly, but one of our participants says, do you think Joe Biden is actually in charge?
Well, I think that his career, he's not a leader. He's an enabler. He's an enabler of the Washington swamp. He's always been that. If people want segregation, he's for that. If people want, forced mandates, he's for that, and so forth. So I think that's essentially his career, and he's been enriched himself and his family as a result of that. Let me just throw out, to give a slight perspective, since we started with Afghanistan, we're talking about Biden coming right when people are least trusting of him. But a few numbers, to give us perspective, is the accounting of the war in Afghanistan resulted in 2,400 American service members, 3,800 American contractors, 66,000 Afghan security forces, 47,000 Afghan civilians and others were killed.
Wow.
That's a total of 238,000 people killed. And the cost is over $2 trillion. So if you were a veteran, or you're in a family that has veterans, and you sacrificed and you're having health problems, or just the fact that you know people who died or are seriously injured, you're upset. And I think that is not going to that's not going to blow away. Because these are, we talked about relationships, and relationships of these people cannot just be thrown out the window.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that deepening question about the reliability of these elites is going to continue to grow. Whether it's manifested in the recall, none of us know, but we'll find out in the weeks ahead.
Very soon, that's right. We did mention earlier, by way of background on the COVID question and whether it's been properly handled, that we had this fascinating interview with Dr. Scott Atlas. I would invite people to check it out on our website. It's pretty easy to go to our website. We've got independent.org, which you can see here. And if you go to the multimedia page, you can see our video from Dr. Scott Atlas. Very much worth viewing, easy to find. There it is, just to give you a taste of it. And of course, we have so many more resources on independent.org. Our purpose is to enable ordinary citizens to get the facts, get the evidence, get some tools to analyze. That's why we do these conversations. We bring you both principles and evidence, and hoping that you will become informed judges of all these things yourselves. Any final comments from either of you before we sign off from our friends?
Things are happening. Let's put it that way.
They sure are. They sure are. From Bill?
No, thank you, Graham, for leading this discussion.
And thank you, Bill. We
are really grateful to all of our friends around the country and maybe overseas who join us for Independent Outlook. Please join us in a couple of weeks. And by any time you want to, please reach out to us through our website, independent.org, for resources that can help you on these and many topics. Goodbye, everybody from California. Bye-bye.